With ISIL attacks on the rise, we ask, what drives these killers to violence and what role does religion play? Also on the show, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi's election as the de facto head of state in Myanmar was supposed to be a turning point for democracy and human rights in that country. But why doesn't she seem to be doing anything to stop the persecution of Myanmar's Rohingya Muslims? That's our debate. But first, while the Muslim-majority world bears the brunt of most of ISIL's attacks, the West has also seen a rise in violent incidents, including the recent London atrocities. But why do young men from the UK or France or Belgium turn to violence? And how much of a role does religion play? Earlier, I spoke to one of Europe's leading authorities on terrorism, this week's headliner, Gilles Kepel. I began by asking him what's driving these attacks.
Well, I believe that, this is part and parcel of what I call in the book the third-generation jihadism. The one that was not satisfied with the attacks on America and 9/11 because they thought it was sort of top-down thing. They threw people in the air in planes, but it had no relation with grassroots mobilization. And bin Laden's objective, which was to mobilize Muslim masses under his banner, or as Zawahiri, his mentor, said, under the Prophet's banner, did not function. I mean, they lost in Iraq. And therefore, in 2005, there was this aide of his, this former PR person to Al-Qaeda, by this Syrian engineer by the name of Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, who posted online this global Islamic resistance call, where he targeted Europe as the soft underbelly of the West, and where he said that, as opposed to bin Laden's top-down approach, you needed a bottom-up approach, as they say in Arabic, nizam la tanzim, and that they would find soldiers for the so-called caliphate or jihad amongst the million disenfranchised young Muslims living in Europe. So this was their aim. And
it was a deliberate plan that you think a lot of the foot soldiers today are trying to carry out on behalf of these.
Yeah, it's in black and white or in bytes, because it was an internet book, an e-book, and this is what they tried to do. And they benefited from the fact that there is a lot of disenfranchisement among some what we call banlieues in Europe.
You're best known, or you're well known, for the view, and you express it in the book, in your new book, that there has been a radicalization of a lot of young French Muslims, a radicalization of the Islam that they follow. You talk a great deal about Salafi Islam, especially in the banlieues, in the deprived French suburbs. Your fellow French terrorism scholar, and some might say bête noire, Olivier Roy, says, on the contrary, there hasn't been a radicalization of Islam, there has been an Islamization of radicalism, that angry, alienated young men, maybe some former criminals, who in the past might have turned to Marxism or anarchism or joined a gang, today they'd sign up with jihadism. It's the most fashionable radicalism going. Do you disagree with him?
Absolutely. He just believes that, 20 years ago we had the Red Brigades and the Haute Armee fraction in Germany. It was red in those days, now it's green. Tomorrow maybe it's going to be blue, or I don't know what, because the toolbox you use, and then the radicalization is of the essence, and then the phenomenon changes and it's irrelevant. And I've done a lot of surveys in the banlieues, and until recently, because I've been under death threat from ISIS, so it's for me it's a little more difficult for me to go there. But both fieldwork and reading the literature. The literature, when I started, when I was young, you read books. Now you have to read to be on the chat rooms on the internet, and and if you don't sort of blend the social issue and the ideology, you miss the whole point.
So on that point, on the blend, are you on the side that says ideology is a bigger factor, a more important factor than the social circumstances or the economic circumstances or the identity crises that these guys may have gone through, etc.?
It's not necessarily bigger, but it's very important. You cannot shun it, and you can't shun the social factor either.
What's the balance? People want to understand where this threat's coming from. How much attention, how much weight should they give to ideology? For example, many in the Trump White House would say ideology. That's what matters. Everything everything else is irrelevant. Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, you know, in America, it's not exactly the same social dimension because there were attacks in America, like the Orlando attack, where the murderer played allegiance to the so-called caliph from the toilets of the gay bar in the Pulse in Orlando, or there was San Bernardino, or when you had Major Nidal Hassan at Fort Hood, who followed Awlaki's, inspiration. But, you know, the global deprivation in America is not really linked to people who immigrated from Muslim countries. On the contrary, many Muslims sort of made it up to the middle class in America.
You say you've done the field work, you've listened to the sermons, but if you look at some of the most famous attackers in France, or infamous attackers in recent years, the Kouachi brothers who carried out the Charlie Hebdo attack, the Abdeslam brothers in the Paris attacks, the Nice attacker, the guy who killed a police officer in Paris on the eve of the election, they were all either drug dealers, petty criminals, ex-convicts, people on the fringes of society, people who had failed at life. They weren't exactly devout Islamic scholars or Salafi ideologues, were they?
It's not, no, they were not ideologues, but you know, usually the ideologues don't go and kill people, they just inspire them. The Kouachi brothers had done a lot of time in jail already, where they had been socialized by at the time, the top Al-Qaeda leader in France, the Franco-Algerian Jamal Behal, who was in jail just above their cell. One of the brothers, and Ahmedi Koulibaly, who killed people at the Jewish hyper-kosher supermarket 2 days after. And the Kouachi brothers had tried to go to Iraq in jihad, for jihad in 2005. So they had a long history of both.
But even when they tried to go to Iraq, my understanding is because they saw pictures of Abu Ghraib, they were angry about the Iraq war. It wasn't because they listened to a sermon in a mosque.
No, they did. They listened to the sermon of the guy who's become quite famous now, called Farid Benyettu, who was a Salafi preacher, a radical Salafi preacher from Algeria, and who then was arrested, who did his time, and who's now part and parcel of some de-radicalization program. And definitely he was the guy who sort of brainwashed them. And the same was true with Abdeslam brothers who went to the so-called Caliphate territory, where they were socialized into a violence, beheading, and you saw the graphic videos.
But they also owned a bar until a few weeks before the attacks. A lot of pious Salafis will say, look, you don't have to like us or our beliefs, but we don't do that. We don't support that, nor do we blow stuff up, nor do we own bars.
This is what, not bars, but a bar with alcohol, but where people dealt with drugs, did drugs. You know, this is what you could call the Molenbeek blend, where you have Salafism on the one hand and drug dealers on the other hand. And the two, you know, give a hand to each other, because who cares about doing drugs with the kuffar, you know, because it poisons their life and it doesn't matter. So it's a matter of balance, definitely, and it's not mutually exclusive.
You say it's not mutually exclusive, but to a lot of outsiders, it looks like on the one hand you're saying Abu Musa al-Suri, this is a manifesto, these are holy warriors. On the other hand, you're accepting the socio-economic circumstances, the overlap with crime. It's very hard to unpick then what it is we should focus on, where the threat is coming from.
Both. This is the difficulty, because you know, some ideologues that you mentioned, I mean, Western ideologues, to say that.
So you're not that much opposed to Olivier Roy's thesis, then? You're saying
I'm completely opposed.
No, because
to him.
he's saying look at these guys. They are petty criminals. They're disillusioned. They're on the fringes of society.
Yeah, but
where you're arguing about is the role of Salafi ideology.
He doesn't understand
them
anything to the ideology, because you have to know the language, you have to know the culture. He doesn't know a word of Arabic, so therefore he says it's useless to speak Arabic.
And a lot of terrorism experts, it's not just Olivier Roy, say ideology is the excuse, it's the justification, but it's not what motivates these people. For a lot of these guys, because how do you explain the fact that a lot of Salafi ideologues are not blowing stuff up? The majority of Salafis are not committing crimes or blowing things up. We may disagree with their beliefs or views, but they're not carrying out acts of violence.
This is why you have to study the ideology to have the answer to your question, because most Salafis are not jihadists, on the contrary. But you know, they have the same core sort of motto, which is in Arabic, al-wala wal-bara'a. Al-wala means obedience, total obedience to the Salafi scholars, and al-bara'a means disavowal, or making yourself, literally translated from the Arabic, innocent from, right? But you know, your average Salafi, people who you know, follow instructions coming from some other scholars in the Petromonarchies, do not attack, do not go to violence. But jihadists, on the basis of this ideology, turn to violence. And then this is where the social dimension comes into action. So you have to understand the blend.
Before we finish, we're running out of time, just on this issue, because you say it's ideology and an agenda. You refer in your new book to Islamophobia in scare quotes. You call it a buzzword, a propaganda term used by Islamists. So what would you call the attacks on mosques, on women in hijab, the hundreds of attacks and threats against Muslims that are recorded every year by France's National Human Rights Commission? They're not Islamophobic? What are they?
No, if people, the problem with Islamophobia is that it mixes criticism against a doctrine, which is perfectly permissible. I mean, you can criticize the texts of the scriptures of the Jews or the Christians. That's one thing which is permissible, and then attacking someone as a person because of what she wears, of her faith, or whatever. This is not permissible.
So what would you call those attacks on Muslim institutions, on Muslim women in headscarves, on Sikhs who look like Muslims?
Yeah, well, this is tantamount to racism, and there are laws in France to punish that. And if you feel that you're being discriminated,
but if you attack a white woman in a hijab, how is that a racist? Many would say that's not a racist attack. No, I'm just wondering, what word? You don't like the word Islamophobia. What word would you use?
Because this word is mixing up things.
You've explained
which
that.
have not
What word would you use?
Attacks against Muslims, like attacks against the Jews.
So you accept that there are anti-Muslim hate crimes,
of course,
and they're
just
serious
like
problems.
there are attacks.
So it's a pedantic point to go after Islamophobia.
No,
when we accept there's a real phenomenon of anti-Muslim hatred, what we call it is irrelevant, is it not? Shouldn't we first recognise the problem?
It's not pedantic. It's an issue of mixing.
Some might say it sounds like you're downplaying the threat by going after the pedantry.
But it's not. It has nothing to do with the pedantry.
Well, it's about the word. You're accepting there's a real phenomenon of anti-Muslim hate crimes.
If you attack homosexuals, or because they're homosexuals, if you attack Muslims, homophobia, whatever, or if you attack women because they're women or whatever, or the elderly because they're old. Therefore, these are phenomena of discrimination that have to be punished. And we
give them names: homophobia for attacks on gays, but not Islamophobia for attacks on.
Because it mixes up things, as I told you. You know, because Islamophobia.
So your issue is with the name, but it's not with the phenomenon. There's a very real.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You accept that?
Yeah.
One last question. Last year, you were put on a ISIL hit list, and you've had to get 24-hour security as a result, which is, of course, horrific. It must be a horrific experience for you. What's it been like for you to go from being a lifelong analyst of terror threats to now being the victim of one?
Well, you know, I'm still alive, and the guy who wanted to have me killed has been drowned. So, you know, that's one thing. And I've been studying those issues for the last 30 years. I guess that this is the price to pay when you're trying to speak the truth about social issues. And well, if you're being targeted and killed and sentenced to death because you do your work as a social scientist, then the problem is not with you, it's with the ones who target you.
Gilles Kepel, thank you very much for joining me on UpFront.
My pleasure.
Thank you. In November 2015, a landslide election victory for Nobel Peace Laureate Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party seemed to signal a new era of freedom and democracy for Myanmar. The military junta would be put back in its box, ethnic conflicts would be resolved, the much oppressed Rohingya Muslims would have their rights protected. But it hasn't turned out that way, with violence now on the rise. So has Aung San Suu Kyi betrayed the principles she once stood for, or is she being held to an unfair standard? Joining me to discuss this in the arena are Aung San, Burmese author and scholar, and Jose Ramos Horta, former president of East Timor and a Nobel Peace Prize winner himself. Thank you both for joining me on UpFront, gentlemen. Aung San, let me begin with you. Aung San Suu Kyi is getting heavily criticised these days by the UN, by human rights groups, by the Pope and the Dalai Lama even, for not doing enough to protect democracy, human rights, minority rights in Myanmar. How did she go from Nobel Peace Prize winner and a former political prisoner herself to being this target of growing global criticism?
Well, there seems to be like two different Aung San Suu Kyi here. One, you know, that the international community consider a defender of human rights, minority rights, and against oppression, for which she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991. And then the other is a politician, in which she insists that she has always been an opposition leader of opposition party NLD and never been a human rights defender. And so I think there is a reality, Aung San Suu Kyi, the real Aung San Suu Kyi, and the icon that has been manufactured but through the media and the international community. And so that is a major fundamental conflict at work here.
Jose Ramos Horta, Mongzani says there are two Aung San Suu Kyis, the manufactured icon and the very real politician who isn't a human rights defender. What's your response to that?
Suu Kyi inherit an extraordinarily difficult situation, very complex, delicate. She has to deal with the military who still have enormous power. She inherits a very fractured society with more than 18 armed insurgencies, ethnic groups, and this is a very difficult transition from military dictatorship to democracy. For her to survive in this context, she has to try to work with the military. She cannot antagonize them. She cannot antagonize the hardliners, ethno-nationalists, Buddhists, monks, and others. So it's an extraordinarily difficult situation for her.
So you're basically saying give her a chance, give her time.
Yes, exactly. My point is give her a chance. We have to understand her difficulties. Criticisms are welcome, criticisms are necessary, but sometimes the criticism probably is misdirected more to her than to the military.
Mongzani, what about Jose Ramos Horta's point that the military is still wielding huge power? Critics of Aung San Suu Kyi, do they recognize the fact that she doesn't control the Interior Ministry, the Defense Ministry, the Border Ministry? Aren't you being unfair to her when you don't recognize the limits of her power?
We know that Aung San Suu Kyi does not control the armed forces, but in this situation of the national persecution of Rohingya Muslims, the military is not the only institution that is involved. She controls 4 other ministries that are directly involved in dismissing, denying, and legitimizing the persecution of the Rohingyas. Information Ministry, Religious Affairs Ministry, Immigration Ministry, Foreign Affairs Ministry, of which Aung San Suu Kyi is the minister, and finally, the office of the Myanmar State Councillor, which is Aung San Suu Kyi. All those 5 ministries that she has direct control over are directly involved in this process of national persecution of Rohingya.
Let me put that point to Jose Ramos Horta. Mongzani has a point, doesn't he, that she may not control the military directly, but she is the de facto president of the country. She is the foreign minister. She does control huge amounts of information. She has huge legitimacy, and she's not speaking out against the dehumanization of the Rohingya. In fact, she's contributing to it. Her official website talked about fake rape in Rakhine State. When the UN talked about gang rape of Rohingya Muslims, her website put out a statement saying these are all fake rapes. She's denied there's ethnic cleansing. She's called it Muslim on Muslim violence. She's played a huge role, hasn't she, in dehumanizing them?
First, let me say, I have written, I have a co-author, I have spoken on the persecution of the Rohingya. So my record on that is absolutely clear. It's an abominable situation. Kofi Annan, at the invitation of the Myanmar government, at the invitation of Suu Kyi, came to Myanmar on a number of occasions and in the region, produced a report and a set of recommendations. According to Kofi Annan, Suu Kyi has responded very positively, and we must give them a chance.
With respect, Jose Ramos Horta, you didn't actually answer my question, which is that when her website says fake rape, isn't that outrageous that Aung San Suu Kyi's own official website is saying it's all fake rape in Rakhine, despite what the UN says?
Well, I haven't seen the website. I don't go around reading the website of the Myanmar government. And
okay, but on the wider
point,
point, she is the foreign minister and de facto president. Surely she could be speaking out more rather than constantly denying that there are crimes against the Rohingya. Surely you agree with that?
Let me say again, she's handling and very complex, delicate situation. Any false step by Suu Kyi will be used by her enemies, her adversaries in Myanmar, those who do not wish the transition to democracy, those who do not wish to see democracy succeeding in Myanmar.
Mongzani, Jose Ramos Horta says it's a very complex situation. You can't risk undermining democracy if she says the wrong thing or does the wrong thing, given the pressure on her. Are you risking her falling from power? Is that what you want to see?
No, I think, you know what? I have supported Aung San Suu Kyi for 15 years as an activist foot soldier. Of course, like the last thing, someone like myself, like who was inspired by her initially, will want to see is Aung San Suu Kyi fail. But the problem is, there has to be a line that we draw as a human rights community and simply human community as a Burmese society, where over 1 million people are being subject to genocide, and then at their expense, we say, let's keep the transition going, let's keep the military happy, and let's be
but just to be clear, Mongzani, you want to see her continue as president. You're not asking for her to step down. You don't think it was better to go back to the way it was, where it was a full military rule?
No, absolutely not. I've been in exile for almost 30 years, and it's in my vested personal interest that this transition process succeed, because my old mother, almost 80, is there, and unless democratization succeeds, I will never be able to see her or at her funerals. And so I think what I am arguing, not simply as an activist or a scholar, I'm saying as a Burmese and a Buddhist at that, we cannot have a transition in the midst of a genocide, and also if we include other ethnic minorities, we have a civil war, very active civil war against the Kachin and other minorities in the Chinese-Burmese border area.
So what should she do? What one thing should she do that she's not doing?
Well, she has to, face up to the reality and the factual truth that the Rohingyas are, or they have always been, a part of Burma.
Jose Ramos Horta, please.
First, I would advise my brothers and sisters, the Rohingya community, in Myanmar or abroad, do not use violence. Do not respond violence with violence. I advise Suu Kyi to persist in engaging in dialogue with the Rohingya leaders, those inside the country, with the Muslims in general in Myanmar. Bring them to the dialogue, talk with the military. And I would advise also the international community to direct the pressure where it should be, and that is at the military and the hardliner Buddhist monks in Myanmar, who have been consistently behind instigating the anti-Rohingya, anti-Muslim sentiment.
Jose Ramos Horta, Aung San Suu Kyi is the first person to deny what the UN is saying, and yet you won't criticize her for that. You haven't criticized her once for saying there's no ethnic cleansing, there's no human rights abuses, there's no rape against the Rohingya.
No, I'm saying, Kofi Annan got reaction from Suu Kyi stating her response to their recommendation, Kofi Annan's commission recommendation, was very positive. We wait for the implementation of the recommendations made by the Kofi Annan's investigation and commission.
Mongzani, let me ask you this before we run out of time. Do you think history, you said you've known her for years, you supported her for years. Do you think historians will look back and remember Aung San Suu Kyi as the Nobel Peace Prize winning dissident, political prisoner, democracy activist and opposition leader, or will they remember her as a political leader who stood by as thousands of innocent people were killed on her watch? How will history remember her?
Well, in a word, she will be remembered as a genocide denier. She is not simply standing by when thousands of people are driven out of the country. She is actually culpable. She is aiding and abetting wittingly out of her anti-Muslim racism.
Jose Ramos, do you believe Aung San Suu Kyi has 4 years left of her term? If things carry on like they are now, where the violence is getting worse and worse, do you think, how will history remember your fellow Nobel laureate? In a good way or a bad way?
History is not done and evaluated in the course of 1 year period. It takes much, much longer. Suu Kyi has to continue to work very firmly with the military, with the security forces, to put an end to the violence on Rohingya people.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you for joining me on UpFront. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.